I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. As always, I'd like to remind you that this show is now entirely listener-supported, no advertisers. So I need you to head on over to patreon.com/parallaxviews. Again, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews, and make a monthly donation. With that out of the way, on this edition of the program, we're going to be hearing from Greg Khalil. I spoke to Gregory a few months ago about his work with the Telos Group, which has sought to bring together people of different faiths in efforts at peacemaking, especially in relation to Israel-Palestine. Greg is a Palestinian American, and he has engaged in outreach to the Evangelical Christian community. We'll talk about that in the discussion to follow, as well as the history of Christian Zionism, and much, much more. So, without any further ado, let's get right to it with Greg Khalil. Welcome to Parallax Views, guest that I'm very excited to be speaking with. He was recommended to me by another guest, and I find his work really interesting. He's the co-founder and president of Telos, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit group that equips American leaders and their communities to better engage seemingly intractable conflict. And we're speaking with Greg Khalil. How are you doing?
I'm good. Great to speak to you, Joe.
So I didn't give a full bio there. Maybe you can give your background and how you got involved in dealing with the Palestinian issue.
Well, that's an easy question because I'm Palestinian. So I was born and raised in the States, but I think part of the reason that you wanted to have me on is you're interested in how faith communities and specifically evangelical Christians have engaged Israel-Palestine. And that's a longer answer. I come from a Palestinian Christian family. My dad was Palestinian, born and raised in Bethlehem, but I was born and raised here in the States. And so I lived with this reality of knowing that I had this huge family on the ground in Palestine, outside of Bethlehem, but seeing how American Christianity completely ignored or worse, just saw Palestinians and all Palestinians as these evil terrorists in this large play. So long story short, later in life, I became a lawyer, and I moved to Ramallah in the Palestinian territories, and I advised the Palestinian leadership on negotiations with Israel. I went there feeling that a lot of the problem in Israel-Palestine, in fact, much of the problem wasn't necessarily on the ground over there, but it was back here in America, how we spoke about it. And with this awareness, having grown up in a Christian community, that many Christians were, in my view, part of the problem in the Holy Land, and specifically evangelical Christians. And so that led me on another journey, which led me to some of the work that I do today, which is trying to get Christians and others to see Palestine and Israel through a human rights lens and to take action on that.
I want to get into your encounters with evangelicals, but are there any other denominations that you've encountered or dialogued with? I come from a Catholic background, so I'm always
Yeah.
interested because I know a lot of Catholics that are very drawn to this issue because they're interested in Catholic social teaching. So the human rights element is very important to those of us who grew up on Catholic social teaching. But I'm just curious if you've ever had experiences with other denominations like Catholics or other Christian denominations.
Well, I have, and I want to be clear from the outset. Like, I come from this not from like a faith-based perspective. Instead, I think that one of the ironies of this current moment for progressives like myself is that we overlook some of our fundamental principles, and one of those is realpolitik. You have to see the world as it is. So this isn't, if you want to change it, and the fact of the matter is, our world is highly religious, and particularly America is a highly religious country. Most people don't understand that America is an outlier among nations in the world, that we are both wealthy and religious. The majority of Americans pray at least once a day. And progressives don't recognize that there's this reality. And so this is how people organize. This is how people build movement. This is how they affect policy. This is how they affect politics. And if we want to drive systemic change, this is how you build coalitions with people who are often very different. So your question about have I come across, yeah, like I've lived a really weird life in a lot of different places. And I myself don't come from an evangelical background. I grew up in a very religious Orthodox home. The majority of Palestinian Christians are actually Orthodox, and this is the oldest Christian community in the world. They're the next largest percentage of Palestinian Christians is Catholic, and in fact, these two communities, you may be interested to know, this is a whole nother rabbit hole conversation, but they have an outsized role on the ground because the largest landholders in Israel and Palestine, outside of the Israeli government and Jewish National Fund, the JNF, are the churches. And these landholdings go back 1,600 years and longer in many instances. And so it's this great irony that, the so-called Holy Land is this place of such like unholy realities today. But these faith communities have had and will continue to have a really profound influence on what actually happens in people's lives on the ground. So they can't be ignored.
Now, usually when people, including, colleagues that I know that are in journalism or they do radio shows or podcasts about these subjects, usually when the subject of evangelicals or Christian Zionism comes up, they paint this very, I would say, simplified picture of John Hagee and, apocalyptic rapture, and that's the only interest that these evangelicals have is bringing about the apocalypse so that rapture can happen. I think you would push back on that a little bit, and I think you provide a different perspective. Can you get into that?
Sure. I mean, I think first, some of that is true. That's out there, and it's a big motivator. And particularly since October 7th, there are these end of times scenarios, apocalyptic scenarios that some evangelicals have, some Jewish communities have, and some Muslim communities have as well, that are very much informing how people are processing the current moment. So that's definitely there. But like any story, any community, like evangelicals are not a monolith. There's a wide range of evangelical positions on Israel Palestine and motivations around Israel Palestine. You may be surprised to know that the majority of evangelicals today support a ceasefire, and so like if you just tell the fire and brimstone version, like that doesn't quite add up. And the history of evangelicalism in Israel Palestine is one that like I came with a very narrow view of it. I come from a personally like a very liberal background, and like evangelicals were just through these crazy people who stood against everything I stood for, and the world was a worse place because of them. And like, they were these caricatures until I got out on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and I had to, in my role as a negotiator, meet with members of Congress, meet with, different leaders, faith leaders who bring these beliefs in. And I had to like not, change my beliefs, but like actually try and understand who these communities were and where these people were coming from. And in fact, one of the first people that I met in a professional capacity back in 2004 is a man named Todd Deatherage. an evangelical Republican from Arkansas, who was then a senior State Department official, a political appointee in George Bush II's administration, and basically like exactly the, the opposite of anyone I would want to have anything to do with back in the States. But I believed then, as I believe now, that like so much of what's happening on the ground there is a function of what's happening here, our broken political system back here. And if I wanted to change US policy, he's exactly the person I needed to reach. So I went on this long sort of like journey that I'm still on, and I've realized that, like, wait a second, there are a variety of evangelical understandings of the world. There's not just this one caricature. Just as there are a variety of Jewish and Muslim and American, there's not one single story about anything. And these stories are so important. I mean, just two quick things. One is like, for Palestinians, like obviously, like that's, most of my family still lives there, and I advocate a human rights message. I don't believe there's a good future for any Israeli or Palestinian without a good reality for everyone there. So like I'm actively working towards what I believe this future reality in which everyone knows safety, dignity, freedom, equality, and justice, Palestinian and Israeli. But one of the things, my primary objectives is obviously selfish and self-interested. And for my family and my people who, I, not in an organizational capacity, but personal capacity, believe are targets of genocide at this particular moment. And so I would remind folks who are interested in Palestinians that, like, we have one export, and that's Christianity. And there are 2.2 billion Christians in the world. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and it's this historical anomaly that these communities who should be providing all sorts of support, it's some of these communities who are most violently opposed to human rights on the ground. And the second thing that I think many people miss with regards to Israel-Palestine is just how influential these movements are globally. So one historically, Lord Balfour, you may have heard of the Balfour Declaration, 1917, often thought as sort of the inciting moment of the modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was a dispensationalist evangelical Christian. He was also in charge of helping to colonize Ireland before he moved the black and tans from Ireland to Palestine, like all sorts of interesting footnotes there. But like right up through Mike Pence and Donald Trump, and the fastest growing religious movement in the world today, particularly in the global South, is Pentecostalism, a form of evangelical Christianity which preferences Christian nationalism, including Christian Zionism. You see this playing out in Brazil, in Argentina, in sub-Saharan Africa, even in South Africa, even in parts of East Asia right now. And so these movements are really significant. They're significant for Israel-Palestine. They're significant in terms of their potential for transforming the place, and they're significant for our domestic politics and geopolitics right now. And unfortunately, many people from my communities on the left have a real blind spot and antipathy to even learning about the possibility that some members of these communities are folks you could actually work with. And some people are going through incredible transformations in these communities right now, especially young people.
Can you talk a little bit about your encounter with Todd and how you've ended up working over the years with him? What are the origins? Like, give me the origin story here.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Haven't told this one in a long time, but I was I was a young lawyer, and I just moved to Palestine to work on the negotiations as part of this group then called the Negotiation Support Unit, advising the Palestinian leadership. And I came, with this experience of growing up in the States as a Palestinian Christian, and also knowing that many people don't know that we exist, much less it's the first Christian community in the world. Like, still, I'm not a particularly religious person myself, but people, when I meet people, this will sound like a really terrible joke, but it's true. And they find out like I'm Palestinian Christian, they'll be like, "Oh, when did you convert?" And like, 2000 years ago. Like, when it's like, they forget that like Jesus was a rabbi, Jewish, and like, he was born in Bethlehem, and the first Christians go back to this period then. And so I'd like come with this, with this desire to try and use the Palestinian Christian piece as a bit of cognitive dissonance. Many people came with like this this binary in their head that like Israel, Jewish state, Palestinians, Muslims, post 9/11, Palestinians, bunch of Muslim terrorists. And it's, it's, to me, it's not a faith-based issue. It's not about religion, but the fact that there are Palestinian Christians who see themselves as Palestinian, have been part of the struggle, who have suffered exponentially worse in some instances, like in Gaza right now, that other segments of the Palestinian community, like that was an important story to get out. And so we had some mutual friends. He was coming on as a part of a visual State Department visit, who said, hey, you got to meet this guy, Greg, in his
Yeah,
office.
so
And
Todd was a former State Department official, right? Yeah.
yeah, he was at the State Department. He was at the human rights sort of he was in charge of this human rights report. And this was 2004. Israel was building the wall, the barrier, security fence, whatever you want to call it. And I wanted to show Todd around with my colleague, and we spent a day together, and he had a transformative experience, like that I didn't fully appreciate at the time. But he started like seeing just how deeply impacted Palestinians were. And, he would later say, look, I cared about Israel. I come from this background, but now seeing this other reality is like, wait a second, what's going on here? This isn't good for Israel, but this certainly isn't good for Palestinians. So fast forward 4 years, I spent my time in the negotiating team. I took around a bunch of leaders from a variety of different backgrounds, and I developed even a set of relationships with other conservatives and Christians. Todd got promoted. He was chief of staff for policy planning under Condoleezza Rice, in part responsible for Israel-Palestine. And I had this idea, like, because I saw people like Todd and many hundreds of folks, Todd, and I'm trying not to make this about me, but this is how we reconnected. I had this idea when I was leaving the negotiations, like, wait a second, if what's missing is a human rights-based movement in the US, it's multi-faith and multi-partisan, we've all been skipping the first step. And the first step is you got to get people to care. So what if enabled thousands of American leaders and key people like them to have similar life-changing transformations to Todd? Like, could we then build this larger movement and weave these folks together? And that's where the idea for Telos came along. And Todd and I hadn't really connected. In fact, like, I forgot about this for many years, but do you remember, Joe, there's a show on CNN back in the day called Crossfire with Bob Novak
Yes.
and Tucker Carlson? Yeah. So I had hosted Bob Novak on a bunch of trips on the ground. He was this conservative commentator when I was on the
I'm
negotiation.
familiar. Yeah, he had the nickname the Prince of Darkness.
The Prince of Darkness. Yeah, exactly. And so, anyways, he wrote a number of really profound articles in the Washington Post, and he got such pushback about, predicting everything that we're seeing today, actually, and saying that there had to be a change in policy. And I was in DC, and he hosted this dinner for me at the Army Navy Club with 25 conservative leaders. And Todd was invited, and he came up. And so he came over. It was really like a bizarre experience for me, but we reconnected. We started talking again. And then I told him this idea. We met for coffee at Starbucks near in Foggy Bottom, which is where the State Department's headquartered. And I just told him about this idea. And like, to my surprise, he was a political appointee, so he's getting ready to leave as Bush finished his term. He said, that's exactly what needs to happen. People have to first see what I saw. That's key. Let me build this with you. And so he proposed that we partner. I was like this young kid. I'm like, why would this guy who's about to go off and make tons of money lobbying with 4 kids in school want to do this? But it really, Joe, I have to confess that was a very convicting moment for me, because sometimes you see people from different sort of categories or whatever, different boxes, as two-dimensional. And it was like, wait a second, here's this guy, with an accent from Arkansas, who's an evangelical Republican, Bush appointee, and he's literally willing, because he saw something that personally convicted him, he's literally willing to risk his future compensation with his kids in school to do what he feels called to do. And that's huge. And to put a fine point on this, I talked to him in 2008, and I moved, and he agreed to do this in 2008. I moved to DC to found Telos a week after Lehman Brothers failed. So we literally had no financial prospects. He wasn't Palestinian like me. He wasn't advising the PLO. He didn't need to do any of this, but he took this upon himself because he said, hey, this is my community. This is my responsibility. We got this wrong. And so that's how that all began in 2009. We founded January 2009.
Was there anything that, I mean, I should probably ask Todd himself at some point if I ever can get him on, but was there any, what was his sort of maybe awakening point, or what's an awakening point you've seen for a lot of evangelicals on this issue?
Well, for him, it was, I mean, he'll say, and you should get him on because, like, I can't speak for him, but, he'll say that day we spent with my colleague Michael traveling around Jerusalem and seeing families impacted, it just is like, it's a totally different experience when you encounter something face to face. And we tend to forget that. And I think, the first step to real, transformation, reconciliation, whatever you want to call it, all these big words, particularly if you come from a background of privilege, is to see that there's a problem. And so, like, we often skip over that. So people come with these frames in their head. So the only frame that they have on Israel Palestine is Israeli security. That's the only thing that they've ever had. Or like Israel is divinely appointed by God. Like, and a lot of evangelicals haven't engaged that. So so that's key. I think for people more broadly beyond Todd, I think engaging with Palestinian Christian perspectives is really significant, and getting on the ground. It's those two things together, because when you see something in person, that's a whole different set of facts, and you're accountable to those people, you're accountable to that experience, and then understanding that there are Palestinian Christians who Christians are like, wait, this is the first community. They're dying, they're disappearing, and wait, it's not because they're being slaughtered by these like evil Muslim terrorists. Wait, there's something else going on here. Like, that's a real awakening point for a lot of people.
So I know you've looked at the reasons for why many evangelicals are maybe reluctant to support equality for Palestinians and Israelis publicly, and I think you sort of give like four reasons, or you've said there are four reasons that you've found for that. What are those reasons?
I'm not sure I remember what those are. Like, could you but I can give
I
some.
have one of your articles pulled up. That's what
Okay,
I think the
sorry.
first was you said that many pastors don't know how to navigate the destructive relationship
Oh,
between
okay.
Christianity and
I remember this article now. This was a couple years ago. Sorry for blanking. But yeah, no, I mean, I think there are a number of reasons that people often overlook. I think I don't have the article in front of me, so if there's another point you want to bring out, just ask me. But one is obvious right now. This is a politically fraught issue, and so people feel like they pay a price for speaking up for this issue, and they don't know how to. But I think there's some deeper issues there that we often overlook. And so for many Christians, and not all Christians, but it's not just this idea of like the Jewish people playing a special role in God's plan, which many, not all Christians have. Many, not all evangelical Christians have. There's also in some segments of the society an article of faith against anti-Semitism. And that may sound really kind of like odd to people, given that some evangelical theology, I would argue, is in fact philo-Semitic and even anti-Semitic, some of the stuff around the end times. But anti-Semitism historically, much of anti-Semitism has been driven not just for like 100 years, but a couple thousand years by bastardized Christian theologies. And after the Holocaust, there were some evangelical thinkers, and quite prominent folks who wanted to assume responsibility for what their faith had done and these bastardized Christian teachings. And many of these teachings actually, I said 2000 years, but like we all know of Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther, founder of Protestantism, was a raging, horrific anti-Semite. Like, some of the things that he said were, I mean, just unimaginable. And I'm not going to quote them right here. You can just Google this and look it up. And this was baked into some Protestant theology, and the idea of sort of like, Christians now replacing Jews as the chosen people, and now Jewish people out of favor because they killed Jesus, and like all of these things which were used like right through, Nazism to sanctify, quite literally, the murder of Jewish people. And so one of the four reasons that you cited is that I think there's a real unease there among certain segments of the community who see it as their duty and feel deeply implicated to combat anti-Semitism. I think some of the other reasons get to the, what I mentioned earlier, the politicization of it, of this particular issue. I think there's a lack of encounter with Palestinian perspectives and Palestinian Christian perspectives. And there's a lack of a larger theological framework beyond Christian Zionism. So you have Christian Zionism, there's many varieties of it, but your listeners may be interested to know this is a hugely, hugely successful cultural movement before it was a political movement. So
and it goes far beyond, I mean, most people will mention John Hagee, but it goes far beyond Hagee, and even people who don't, evangelicals who don't necessarily agree with Hagee's interpretation of theology, are influenced by other Christian Zionist texts, such as, the late great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey, etc.
Well, that's exactly right. And, like just to put a fine point on it, like, Orson Welles made a documentary series like in the 1970s, which was one of the best, like this, it had the highest ratings of any like sort of documentary series like of the decade. Some of the best-selling works of the 20th century were Christian Zionist tomes. And so what you see around the world, and there are other distribution networks from mainstream distribution, is that a lot of these ideas and different things, not just about end times, but there's something too your listeners should be aware of called prosperity gospel, and it's a form of Pentecostalism, and it goes back to Genesis with Israel specifically saying, Genesis 12, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, God's promise to Abraham. And so this idea that like, if you bless Israel, you'll be blessed. If you curse Israel, you'll be cursed. That's its most simplistic form, but like a lot of people don't even buy into the end time stuff or aren't motivated by that or have a different view. They really view this as being sort of like honoring God's covenant with Abraham, and sometimes even selfishly as a way to personal favor with God and even wealth. And this is really popular around the world. And, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in South Africa recently, and it's interesting. This is before the recent ICJ cases, but to go into some of the townships, and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa really began in earnest in the churches, and these folks were allied with Palestinians, and PLO folks came and trained, anti-apartheid activists, and there was this real solidarity there. And now, like, you've got this prosperity gospel in some of the townships, and so there's these mega churches there, some of which are Christian Zionists, and have like ATMs in the lobbies in these impoverished townships. It's bizarre, but like this has been a real cultural juggernaut for the 20th century, and it's growing exponentially right now in the global South.
I guess, what are some of the ways that you've sort of done outreach with, I mean, it's really relatively amazing in these polarized times that you're reaching out to conservative voices and evangelical voices, because a lot of people, I think, just have this view of like, no, it's us versus them, and you're really reaching out to people. Can you talk more about how you go about reaching out to people and how we can create dialogue?
Yeah, and I think these principles work not just for Israel-Palestine, but they work for other sort of fraught issues too. I think the first step I alluded to is, is you can't overlook the fact that experience matters. And so this work is definitely not for everyone. It's taxing, but the more you can get people to like have actual experiences that are transformative for them, opens them up. And the good news here is, guess what? Most people are actually curious about the world. Even people who have very clear positions, like I have very clear advocacy positions on certain things that I'm going to fight for because I think they're really important, right? And I have a whole lot more questions about life too. And like I want to do the right thing. I want to grow. I want to live into my values. Most of us are the same way. Most of our political beliefs are formed and really influenced by our social circles. We tend to ignore that. We all want to think we're rational beings, but that's not who we are. Primarily as a species, we have reason as a tool, but getting people to have experiences that force them to examine, okay, this is what I say I believe, but this world doesn't, like, this is fundamental. And I want to put just a fine pin on that because we often like hear all this rhetoric about America being so polarized right now. And I'll say, like, part of the problem that we're facing domestically in America, not just around Israel Palestine, is we don't share an aspiration anymore. Not that we really ever did, but there's no like really shared aspiration for what it means to be American anymore. But we also don't even share the same set of facts. We're living in siloed, separated worlds in which we're talking about different issues and different facts. Immersive shared experience, it takes a lot to get people like that. It takes a lot of investment, but you can do this. We do it domestically as well. But that's the best way for people to like get out of themselves and start really, deeply interrogating, how am I affecting this reality? How do I want to live into it? And so that's the first thing. I'd say the second thing, obviously media storytelling is really critical to this. Good stories, like that's how you get people to care. Like we've all been transformed by storytelling, and so that's something we really lean heavily on in all of our programming. And then the third element that we developed and took a number of years to get here, and I'll tell you, I was really skeptical about this at first, and it really kind of like pushed all my buttons the wrong way. But we developed, we started talking about our work as peacemaking. And we developed these things we call principles and practices of peacemaking. So peacemaking can be like really kumbaya. It can be like, oh, can't we all just get along, right? And that's not what we're talking about. So we really tried to distill like, sociological research, but also from a lot of our partners on the ground around the world where we do these immersive experiences, like what does it mean to actually work towards like mutual flourishing? So that state where every Israeli, every Palestinian knows dignity, freedom, security, justice, equality before, beyond a one or two state solution, whatever. Same here at home. And so we tried to really thoughtfully distill these things down into some teachable concepts that people could use to say, okay, yeah, peacemaking isn't shutting up and sitting on the sidelines when there's an injustice happening. No, actually, it is taking a side, and it is leveraging what I have, my tools, my network, my resources to work towards something. And so how do I do that? What do I look for? So we have these principles, and so the principles are pretty simple. It's like growth, the fact that change is always possible. If you don't believe change is possible, well, I mean, like, what are we doing here, right? But equity, which is a charged word in many circles, but we define it very specifically. We say, equity is not, equality rather is a more common term, but equality asks who has a seat at the table. Equity asks whose table is it? So it's like, am I a guest to your dinner party, or are we creating something shared here in Israel, Palestine, or America? So like, if there's no equity there, if we're not co-stakeholders, co-owners in this, we're not peacemaking. You're just like helping me play a role in your larger game. And so we have those all working towards mutual flourishing. And then we have a number of practices, and I don't need to go into those, but we found that having this framework, which we believe offers insight and real depth, and also skills and tools that people can use in their daily lives, is really deeply appreciated. People want to do the right thing for the most part. There are many people who don't, but most people want to. We from the water that we swim in, and we make our decisions based on what we know. So giving people an opportunity to know something, know someone different, and giving them those frameworks to start thinking about and processing those so that they can access like their power, their responsibility, their deep implication to become active. That's how it happens. And it doesn't happen for everyone, but it happens for a whole lot of people.
I wanted to ask more about that because, you know, how much does I want to be careful how I word this, but I think sometimes another barrier when it comes to I know people that will know that there are Palestinian Christians, but sometimes I think this racial thing comes up where there's still an otherization. It's like, well, they're they're not like Western Christians. I see this done to Armenian communities too. How much of that do you think is an obstacle to, um, you know, getting people to reconsider Christian Zionism?
Oh, I mean, there's so many obstacles there. And I want to say something about those obstacles. I also want to say something about the opportunity as well, because for me, as somebody who's on the sidelines of this, but been, helping to build this movement for a long time, I'm also quite excited about that. And it sounds odd saying that at this horrifically irredeemable moment right now, which we just have to name. Like there's nothing that is going to change the reality on the ground that millions of people are suffering. That is absolutely unthinkable. And we should talk more about that too. But I think, you're right. The obstacles are endless. I'll give you an example. Like, many evangelical Christians won't see me as a Christian. They won't see my family as Christians. In fact, I'm not going to name specifics, but there's like American evangelicals who are evangelizing to Christian Palestinians because they don't believe that we're Christian, because we don't believe what they believe. And so it's like, we're just cultural Christians, or, we're anti-Semitic because we're not Zionists. So those things are definitely out there. And then there's like a lot of Islamophobia. I mentioned the cultural force that Christian Zionism is. I didn't talk about the political force. And a quick note on that, like Christian Zionism was not really politicized until the beginning of the religious right in the early 80s, but it didn't take off as a political movement until after 9/11. And the reason for that, I think, there's a lot to be written about this, but like our hot take on it, these years out, is that there was this fusion of this shared identity, or this perceived shared identity, with Israelis as victims of terror in this larger spiritual battle between good and evil, and Islam being evil and the Judeo-Christian ethic being good on the other side. So like there are these deeply entrenched, deeply problematic, meta narratives there, and in fact fueled the politicization of the movement. So today, Christian Zionism is a formidable force. You have Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders talking about evangelicals being the support for Israel, not Jewish people, because of the shifts in younger Jewish, Americans and Jewish people in other parts of the world as well. And so it's become this politicized force. And like, to put a fine point on that, Christianity Today, I think 2 years ago, published, this is, well before October 7th, published a graph charting the top lobbying expenses for the top 25 evangelical Christian organizations in the US, which engage in lobbying. And they gave more to Israel, to pro-Israel causes, than pro-life, poverty, LGBTQ gender issues, like all immigration combined. Yeah, so this has become like this real juggernaut, and it's only rising in some sense, like in the short term. We just saw with Nikki Haley and all these other folks. But the opportunity I just want to mention is there are two large opportunities. One, the youth ain't buying it, at least in America. Like there are historic shifts among young evangelicals. And to be perfectly upfront, I don't want to claim credit for this, but this is where we put a lot of our energy, for a number of years, is trying to speak to people who speak to this young demographic. And the numbers are staggering, going from around 70% pro-Israel only down to low 20s, with a majority wanting equal rights for all Israelis and Palestinians, expressing equal sympathy for them both. And there's a real shift there that's not just Israel-Palestine, but a rejection of some of these core ideas around Christian nationalism, which includes Christian Zionism. And the other opportunity there is, I think there are a lot of people, particularly in America, which is shifting religiously, but there are a lot of Christians who are saying, wait, these teachings that I grew up with about Jesus, or some people who would define themselves as believers who say, I have this relationship with Jesus, this is really important to me. I believe what he said, to love your enemies. I believe what he said, to do good to those who persecute you. I think this is a commandment. Blessed are the peacemakers. And what I see about, and these Christian communities around the States and around the world right now is, wow.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you even see that with, I think there has been shifts amongst evangelicals, especially since the rise of Trump and MAGA, because I do notice there are more and more evangelical Christians saying, I don't know if I'm for this, even if leaders within the community are telling them to be for it. I mean, I think there's a lot more. um I don't know if diversity is the right word, but I feel like there's shifts happening that people aren't paying enough attention to.
Yeah, and that's what the polling bears. I'm not familiar with polling more recently since 2023 on this issue, but last year there was an interesting poll out which showed that when you so there's a variety of ways to define evangelical. There's one method which is very sort of like strict, but typically pollsters simply ask, like, are you a born again Christian, or do you see yourself as an evangelical? You say yes, they count you as that. You say no, they don't. And the other method asks some core beliefs of evangelicalism, like what define it as sort of like a belief system, right? And that's more in depth. And so the polling is really interesting because what it showed is now evangelical as a word doesn't mean a whole lot, because 6% of people who didn't define as Christian or evangelical now do, and 2% who did don't, but hold those evangelical beliefs. And the growth in it, the factor here is not going to church. It's not holding evangelical beliefs. There's a movement, a steady movement over years since the Trump election of people moving out and disassociating from that word, but still holding those core beliefs. And there's an opt-in from people who actually don't go to church and don't hold any evangelical beliefs, who see it as shorthand for Trumpism. So that's what we're seeing in America today. And what's interesting for me is the opportunity among some of these communities that still have incredible sway right now. They're in swing states. It's non-denominational Christians, evangelical Christians in swing states. This is who Biden's been courting. It's who the right is courting as well. There's a growing movement and of folks who are trying to say, not in our name. Instead of abandoning the faith, they're saying, we're going to reform it.
So, for my listeners, why do you think it's so important, if we care about peace in Israel Palestine? Why is it important to bring Christian and specifically evangelical voices into this? What is their role that they could play?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, obviously, I'm interested in this because I've devoted a lot of my life to this. But so take that for what it's worth. But run through a few really significant reasons. One, it's the quote unquote holy land. Regardless of what you believe, faith communities have and will continue to impact this place. And this place is continuing and will continue to impact us. So if we care about a just peace in the Middle East, which we all should, we have to recognize this fact that faith communities, they're the ones who care the most. Two, evangelical Christians have driven this conflict from the very beginning. They're a part of the problem, and some of them are part of the solution. Not all. I'm not talking about like converting Hagee types, but if you look at the polling, these are highly differentiated communities. Three, what drives systemic change on any issue is coalition, not constituency. As a progressive, I am so proud of progressives going out and building a real progressive voice and progressive power. And I don't know, Joe, what your politics are, by the way. Like, we were introduced by a friend, so I'm not going to presume anything on your front. I'm just being transparent about mine. Like, that is part of the work. It's building your tribe. But if we want to actually drive systemic change on these issues that affect all of us, like climate or racial equity or immigration, we have to build coalition. That's not the zeitgeist of the moment, but there are critical people who we can build coalition with who are going to disagree with us or me on other issues that I care just as deeply about and that I'm also active on, like LGBTQ rights and women's reproductive health and things like that. And this is how systemic change always happens. It's through coalition. And so if we're serious about the change and not simply our purity, and I don't mean to be so denigrating by saying that, because that was a little unfair, but I want to say, if we're serious about the change, some part of our movement has to be focused on the coalition piece. And what I'm telling you today, based on my years working as a Palestinian on these issues, is there's extraordinary opportunity with these communities. And it's not just for political movement, it's for sustaining the peace after we finally get to this new reality that none of us can envision today.
So I want to delve into that more, for in case listeners have maybe not picked up. In what ways has the Christian right been a really chief driver of this conflict? Because I think we said before that there is this vision that it's all about apocalypse, right? And that's part of it. But it's also just that there's even for people that aren't necessarily taking the Hagee view, there's sort of a reflexive, I guess, support for Israel
Right.
amongst the Christian right. So can you talk more about the ways in which the Christian right have, driven this conflict?
Sure. I want to just a small historical point to bring out because this was really surprising to me as a lawyer and a student of the conflict and something I started learning a couple decades ago. But like Christians have been in this from the very beginning. Christian Zionism as a theology predates Jewish Zionism. Like there were Christian Zionists calling for return of Jews to Israel, often in very anti-Semitic ways before sort of the maturation of an actual Zionist movement led by Jewish people. And the early sort of, drivers of this conflict, the historic names like Balfour, Lord Balfour, I mentioned Sykes from the Sykes-Picot Agreement. These were folks who were dispensationalist evangelical Christians. The historical record doesn't say a lot about their motivation personally, but they were part of communities that held certain beliefs. And it's known that some folks saw this as not just getting rid of this, horrific idea that they would call their Jewish problem, but they also saw this as an expression of their faith. And since then, right up through Trump, who moved the embassy in 2017, which is a whole story that you might want to talk about sometime, Joe, but specifically for the evangelicals, through Pence, who's a dispensationalist evangelical Christian, to Pompeo, they have increasingly become politicized, and they've been supporting not just pro-Israel causes, but very right-wing causes. They haven't wanted Israel to give up an inch of land, not even in Gaza back during the disengagement when I worked on the disengagement in 2004, when Israel pulled out its troops, its military bases, but tightened its control around Gaza. And we all predicted what you're seeing today, almost 2 decades ago. But like right up through this current moment, and just to put a pin on that, like President Trump's move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, in fact, I would argue is partly what set this dynamic in place. He was trying to get rid of the Palestinian cause, to just say there's the Palestinian cause is over, it's just one to be managed right now, and to sort of isolate Palestinians from other Arab states by passing the so-called Abraham Accords, which is sort of like a free trade agreement with Israel and some of the Gulf nations and other Arab nations.
And
And
it explicitly sort of basically
so
sidelines the Palestinian issue, the Abraham Accords.
that's the point. So to put pressure on the Palestinians, but kowtowing to this evangelical demographic, which wants to see an expansion of the settlements, which wants to see an Israeli entrenched control, which is allied for decades very intentionally with the Israeli right. And so that's where we are today. There is no way around this obstacle on this issue. And so you have to think about it in a few ways. One is like, well, like obviously you got to confront it. That's one aspect. But then two is like, are there ways to build alternate movements in these communities? Are there ways to circumvent it? Three, are there ways to, for people to really self-interrogate, is this really something we care all that much about? Maybe this is like a story that I learned, maybe that's what will happen. Am I really going to invest my life, energy, and money? And should our church be doing this? And then are there coalitions to build that are really exciting and motivating to people, which is what young people are looking for right now? Young evangelical Christians, like they may not be progressive in like a political sense, but they care about doing the right thing. And for them, the right thing is putting human beings and human lives first, not some crazy big picture ideology about end of the world or about I'm right, you're wrong. They want to value every single human life. And there's real opportunity in that.
Just one or two more things here. How important do you think it is for people to understand the ways in which the evangelical community, or maybe more so its leadership, have been sort of politicized, especially since I would say like the Reagan years?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I think it's really important. We're nearing the end of the show, but I'll just give you a small data point that your listeners may not be aware of. There was only one other time in history when the US really stood up to Israel in a big way. This was during President Bush the First's administration. His evangelical Secretary of State, James Baker, pushed forward a plan to hold Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir accountable for settlement expansion in the West Bank. They were, expanding all of these illegal settlements in the West Bank. And what he did is he withheld $10 billion in loan guarantees. Some people will say this is why President Bush lost re-election, and I think there's a case to be made for that. But the reason why I wanted to raise that is just to remind everyone that every ideological movement, every political movement is always evolving. Zionism, as we know it today, was not Zionism at its inception. Early Zionist leaders were actually, in fact, not religious and anti-statist. Their quest for Jewish self-determination, they thought, might, in fact, be hampered by fusing Jewish power with a Jewish state. That wasn't all of them, but that were some of the key leaders.
Right. They're known as cultural Zionists back then, yeah.
Yeah, so exactly. So I'm just using these data points, and the same is true with evangelicals in Israel. Evangelicals in abortion. There wasn't a consensus on abortion in the early 70s. Obviously, we're in a new place today. But the reason why I'm saying this is if we come back to this departure point of realpolitik, it's the Holy Land. The constituencies that care most are constituencies that matter. They're always going to be involved. They don't always need to show up in this way, and they're real historic shifts. Young evangelicals 18 to 30 have been moving faster to a human rights lens on Israel-Palestine than any other demographic in America by 500%. They're really moving into the space. And to ignore that is to ignore the fundamentals of like how we can actually, create a reality in which everyone in the Holy Land enjoys human rights as everyone deserves.
The last question I wanted to ask you, and I hope it's not too much of a curveball, but since you mentioned Todd Deatherage was he worked under Condoleezza Rice. That's a very interesting period when it comes to Israel-Palestine, because I think people forget about the Annapolis conference. And I think people forget that, I mean, Condoleezza Rice said she at least spoke a few good things, saying there should be a Palestinian state. How do you think we got from that moment where there were conservatives that, would talk about the need for a peace to be reached, and we had the Annapolis conference, to, the Trump era where this mentality of let's just sideline the Palestinians entirely. How do we get from there to where we are now?
That's a good question, and I don't have a great answer for it. I mean, there's a lot of analysis to be done here, but I think this is generally the story of the evolution of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. And September 7th was a big, September 11th was a critical juncture in this. And so September 11th got sort of Israel and this particular view of Israel in a theological lens, not just in the cultural sort of imagination of evangelicals on the right, but one of those pillars, along with LGBT opposition to LGBTQ rights, pro-life Supreme Court, gun, Second Amendment rights. Like it was one of those like four basic pillars of the conservative movement. What I do want to, I want to end on a dark note, which I actually think is quite hopeful. And so, I think it's hopeful when you can predict stuff. So you were talking about Annapolis. I was at Annapolis with the Palestinian negotiating team. I worked on the Gaza disengagement process. I spent literally 3 years of my life from 2005 to 2008 talking about what Gaza would look like in 2020. Either it would be this incredibly beautiful place, it's blossoming, if the agreements that Condoleezza Rice, the agreements in movement and access, which my team negotiated, were implemented, or according to Condoleezza Rice, President Bush, Tony Blair, Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, head of the quartet, James Wolfenson, or Gaza would, if it were turned into this prison camp sealed off from the world, it would be a humanitarian crisis and a disaster ready to explode, a Lord of the Flies scenario, and Hamas and other sort of, quote unquote extremist groups, these organizations would only rise in power. This precise scenario was predicted in great detail many years ago. And so this is incredibly frustrating for me. And I'm not saying like this was everybody. Like this Israeli Shin Bet knew exactly what was going to happen. Netanyahu and others obviously saw Hamas as a strategic asset. That's another conversation. But why I'm mentioning this is if you go back to this point, like everybody knew precisely what would happen, what happens to a people when you seal them off, when you control them, when you have them in this indefinite situation that even Israeli organizations call apartheid, right? And it doesn't, in my view, excuse the targeting of civilians and the horrors and atrocities that Hamas committed on October 7th, but it does say, hey, what's happening now was predicted, as horrible as it is. What coming next is predictable. We have to do everything that we can to stop this. We need everybody on our team, whether or not they think and believe like us. It is the Holy Land. These faith communities are important. They're growing in influence domestically. They're growing in influence around the world. They're in flux. And simply buying this binary of the world where we hold reason and they're a bunch of crazies isn't going to help us build coalitions. So there's an opportunity to change things and to create a better world. But me as a progressive, I have to actually work harder on living out my values. It doesn't mean abandoning them. In fact, it means diving more deeply into them.
I know I have to let you go, but just one thing here briefly, because I just thought of it. You mentioned we've talked about the term Zionism, and I don't know if you consider yourself anti-Zionist or not, but I think people don't understand that you could conceivably be anti-Zionist or non-Zionist, but not necessarily anti-Israeli. You could be pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian at the same time. You want peace between all the peoples. And I think people don't understand that. There is a disconnect about that. People assume that, oh, if you're critical of Zionism, you don't want anything good for the Israeli people, or you don't want peace. And I think that's untrue. Can you comment on that?
Well, that's a whole other podcast. Like but yeah, I will. I think sometimes we talk about these terms as if they're algebra. So we're like all doing quadratic equation in our heads. And so and that's not helpful to people who aren't really steeped well in these conversations about what Zionism is and what anti-Zionism is. And what I'll say is there are a range of Zionisms. I've alluded to that in this conversation. It's evolved historically, and today it means many different things to many different people. There are also a range of anti-Zionisms. And it means very many different things to many different people based on your core values. I very much locate myself in fundamental human rights for everyone, whether it's Israel, Palestine here in the US, anywhere. And what I'll say is, I think people have trouble understanding anti-Zionist perspectives because they're just so often conflated as anti-Semitic. So the reason for that, one, is like we don't have a great definition of Zionism to begin with. And Zionism in its simplest form is just saying, hey, Jewish people are a people who deserve self-determination, who deserve human rights like every other people on the face of the planet. And so, and Zionism is the idea that the Jewish people get to control their destiny as a people. And it's come to mean in the state of Israel. And so many people will presumptively go to like, well, if you don't support the state of Israel, then you're anti-Semitic, because like, how could you deny Jewish people what every other people should at least have the right to have? That means you must be anti-Jewish. And so what I would say, well, that's a big philosophical debate, but I want to bring this back to the ground level right here. What I'd say is, like, theoretically, you could make that argument, and I think it's a good formal argument. The problem is when you get back to what we were talking about earlier, the reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is informing the state of Israel. 3/4 of its indigenous Palestinian Muslim and Christian population were kicked out of their homes, and they were never allowed to return. They were basically born the wrong ethnicity and religion in their own land. And so I'm never going to say that was right. That was wrong. That was a wrong that began in 1947, and for Palestinians and their understanding of reality and history didn't stop. It's continuing to this day, and that's how they're understanding even what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank right now, and even parts of Israel right now. And so, what people can go to is they can go to say, hey, look, this horrible thing happened. I think indigenous people in the States can say, this horrible thing happened to us, genocide. We don't necessarily want to bring down the United States of America and just like tear it up and kill everyone. But we're not going to say that what happened to us was right. No, it was wrong. And what's happening to us today is wrong. And so that's where many Palestinians are. And so I would say in that sense, like I'd say like, I could, get behind Martin Buber or Hannah Arendt's idea of Zionism, which is very different than David Ben-Gurion's or certainly Netanyahu's idea of Zionism. But I'd squarely fall in an anti-Zionist camp right now. It's not because I don't want human rights for everyone. In my analysis, like I'm not a nationalist and I support human rights for everyone. And what Zionism has come to mean, this was not its intention, but it's come to mean through the formation of the state of Israel and what we see today is a reality in which Palestinians can never get their fundamental human rights. And I personally believe there is no good future for any Israeli or Palestinian without a good reality for everyone there. That can look like a two-state solution. It could look like Israel as a predominantly Jewish state next to Palestine. It could look like many other things. But from a value perspective, what I want to put forward and what I work towards and try to be as transparent as possible is saying, hey, wait a second. This has to work for everyone ultimately. But right now, there is a massive injustice happening that's making all of us less safe and that is leading every Palestinian and ultimately every Israeli to a very dark place right now. So wherever you think about my views on Zionism, anti-Zionism, you're obviously entitled to your own, but I would ask all of your listeners, if you haven't spoken up, speak up for ceasefire, release of all captives right now, humanitarian aid, conditioning U.S. military aid, call your members of Congress over and over. And if you haven't spoken up yet, your voice is more powerful than it's ever been. So if you've been speaking up and had some difficult conversations a few months ago, have those conversations again. We are literally on the brink of something so much worse. Nobody knows what the day after looks like. It's going to take 80 years, according to the United Nations, to rebuild Gaza. Like we're going into so much uncertainties. But what we do know is if this continues, it's going to be even more catastrophic on a local level and potentially regional and global level too. I don't mean to be a fearmonger, but the analogy I've been using with friends recently before Rafah was, it's like the building on next door is on fire and there are children dying and there's a gas tank in the basement. And if it catches on fire, it explodes and we all die. And next door, some of us are going about our normal lives, or we're debating who started the fire, who's going to have what floor afterwards, what color it will be. I'm like, guys, those are all valid questions. There needs to be accountability. We need to figure this out. But right now there are two jobs: save the kids, stop the fire. So please do whatever you can to do, however small and adequate it means. That will give us all a chance of creating a better reality for every Israeli, for every Palestinian, and perhaps in the process healing some of our divisions here at home.
Thank you so much, Greg Khalil. People can keep up with your work at the Telos Group, right?
Yes.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you'll consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, patreon.com/parallaxviews. It is you, the listener, who makes this show possible. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight. with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.